In this video, we're going to see how to use web scraping to scrape the World Cup scores, store those in a database, and then produce a bar chart using Django and Plotly. So this video is going to be split into 3 parts. Firstly, we're going to use Python and BeautifulSoup, and we're going to use these to scrape the football results from the World Cup from the BBC's website into our application. When we have that data, we're then going to store it in a database so that it's available for our Django web app. And finally, once the data is in the database, we're then going to use that data to produce a bar chart with Plotly. So let's get started now. We have a GitHub repository here. I'll link this below the video. This contains starter code for a Django project that you can use in this video. And I have that project open in VS Code, so let's go there just now. Now importantly, what we're going to do first in this video is we're going to scrape the results from the World Cup, and we're going to do that within a Django management command just for convenience. And this will give us access to our database models that will allow us to store the results in the database. So we have the management command here, and I'm going to change the help text here to just load the data. Now to get started with this project, what you need to do is obviously clone the repository using the git clone command. And then when you have that, you can create a virtual environment and run the pip install -r requirements.txt command. That will bring the requirements into this application. And if we look at what those requirements are, for example, we have BeautifulSoup, which is going to be the library that we use for web scraping. We have Django and Django extensions. And we also have Plotly, which we're going to use to produce the bar chart, as well as requests, which is going to be used to send the requests to the BBC in order to scrape the data. Now in the boilerplate for this project, I've created a model. This is a very basic model for a World Cup fixture. We have Team 1 and Team 2, as well as the number of goals that each team has scored in a particular fixture. Now in a more complex application, you would probably have a separate model for the team, but this is very basic, so Team 1 and Team 2 are just going to be represented by car field. And the starter code also already has a migration for this model. If you go to the migrations directory, in this file here we have the migration that creates the fixture model and the 4 columns that we've specified on that model. So what we need to do now is to create a local SQL-like database. We run the python manage.py migrate command. And that command will create the database and add all the tables from our application and the applications that come with Django. Once we've created the database, we're going to start writing this management command, and the handle function is where you define the logic for the command. Now before we write that, let's start by going to the BBC's website. This is the page for the World Cup, and we have a scores and fixtures tab here at the top. And on this tab is where we can retrieve the scores from the World Cup. Now what we're going to do first in the management command is we're going to define a base URL, which is going to be equal to this URL here in the address bar. So let's paste some code here. So that's the base URL. What we're now going to do is look at the structure of the URLs for each match day. So if we go back to when the World Cup final was, I believe it was Sunday the 18th, we can see that in the address bar, it appends the date to the end of the URL. So we have this base URL and we want to append the date. So what I'm going to do is paste a couple of variables in here. Firstly, we have a start date and also an end date, and that defines when the World Cup started, and that's a date time object set to the 20th of November, whereas the end date is the last game of the World Cup, and that's the 18th of December. And at the top here, I'm going to import from Django.utils the time zone module. And what we also want to do is get the number of days between the start date and the end date. So let's define another variable here called delta, and that's going to be equal to the end date minus the start date, and that produces a time delta object in Python. And to get the number of days in this time delta, we can use the .days attribute, and that will give us back the number of days between the start date and the end date. So let's print that to the terminal, and we can run the command at the bottom with python manage.py scrape results. And you can see that we get 28 days. So the World Cup itself spanned 28 days between the start and the end date. So we have a delta of 28 days. Let's get rid of that print statement. And now we're going to define an empty list for the URLs in this World Cup. And remember, the goal here is to take this base URL and we're going to add each date between the start date and the end date to the end of that URL, and then we'll send a request to the BBC for that date and get the fixtures on the day. So what we're going to need here is a for loop, and we're going to say for I in range, and the range is going to be delta +1. And the reason it's +1 is because we want to include the end date, and the range function is not inclusive of the final value. So we're essentially looping from 0 to 28 here if we add 1. So what we're going to do now is define a new variable, and we're going to call this variable date, and it's going to be equal to the start date plus a timezone.time delta, and the time delta is going to be equal to the number of days that we're looping over. For example, 0 in the first iteration, 1 in the second, and so on. So the first time that this for loop executes, it's going to take the start date and it's going to add a time delta of 0 days, which will just give back the same start date. The second time, it's going to take the start date and it will add 1 day to that, so it will get the next day, and that will continue up to the 28th day. So this essentially gives us a way to generate every day between the start date and the end date. Now if we look at the URL in the BBC address bar, we need to get the date in this particular format here, where we have the year, then the month, then the day. So what we're going to do is convert this datetime object that we have here on line 20, and we're going to use the date.stringFromTime function, and the stringFromTime function takes a format string. So we're going to say %y for the year, %m for the month, %day, and that'll give us the day. And we can reassign the result of calling that function to the date variable. So what that's going to do is take the datetime object on line 20 and it's converting it to a string on line 21 with this particular format. So to demonstrate this, let's print that date out and we'll execute this script again, and we see we now get the dates printed out from the start date to the end date. And the final thing we want to do in this command is we're going to append to the URLs list that we created on line 18. And what we're going to append here, we're going to set an f string, and it's going to be the base URL. And you can see that that base URL ends in a slash here on line 13. So after the base URL, we simply specify the date for this for loop, and that should then give us the correct format for the URL that we want to then send the request to. So that's all the code for the for loop. What we're going to do is print the first URL that's generated within that list, and when we execute this script, we should see the URL, and you can see that it's got the correct format where it appends the date to the end of that URL. So we're going to have 28 URLs within our list. So now that we have the logic for this, what I'm going to do is cut the code from the handle function, and we're going to extract this to its own function within our command. And that function is going to be called construct URLs, and it takes self as an argument here. And we're going to use a bit of Python typing here to indicate that this returns a list of strings, and we can then paste our code into that function here. Now we need to import this list construct from the typing module. So from typing, we can import list. So we now have this function construct URLs. It returns a list of strings. Let's actually add the return statement to that now, and we're going to return the URLs list here. So that's construct URLs. We're now going to copy that and we're going to call that function within our handle method, and we're going to say that the URLs is equal to self.construct URLs. That will return the URLs to us, and then we can keep processing within the handle function. That's a little bit cleaner than putting all of this logic directly in the handle function. So the question now is, what do we do within the handle function? We have the URLs. What we're going to do is use the requests module that we imported on line 5, and to each of the URLs we're going to send a request. So for URL in URLs, we can create a variable here called response, and we're going to use the requests.get function to send a get request to that BBC URL, and we'll pass the URL as an argument there. And once we have that response, what we're going to do is invoke a BeautifulSoup object, and we pass the response.content to that, and we specify a parser here. It's going to be the html.parser, and that's because the content that we're getting back from that BBC URL is HTML content, and we can then store this within a variable called soup. Now, if you're not familiar with BeautifulSoup, it allows you to parse HTML and find data on a web page. Now, the goal that we have is to find the fixtures for any given day of the World Cup in the DOM. So if we look back to the BBC page here, you can see that there's a result here for the Argentina-France game. And if we inspect that in our browser's developer tools, you can see that we get back some elements here that have particular classes attached to them. And you can see that this span here is for the number of goals the home team scored in this particular match, and the text within that element is the number 3. So what we need to gather for our model is the name of the home team and the name of the away team, as well as the number of goals each of those has scored. So let's start with the home team. Now if we make the developer tools a little bit bigger here, what we have is wrapping each fixture, we have this particular div with a class of fixture wrapper. So what I'm going to do is copy this class name, and we're going to reference that within our script here. And just below this comment, I'm going to set up a variable called results, and that's going to be equal to the soup.findAll function. And what we pass to that as our first argument is the element that we want to look for, and then we can pass an underscore class keyword argument, because what we're actually searching for here is divs with a class of fixture wrapper. And we use the findAll function, which returns a list containing all the matching elements that we find. And that's important because there might be more than one on the page. If we go back to the BBC page and close the developer tools here, if we scroll back a little bit to one of the earlier days, you can see that there are multiple games on some of these days. And each fixture is wrapped by a div with this particular class of fixture wrapper. Once we have those results, we can then create a for loop here and say for result in results. And what we now need to find is the name of the home and the away team. So for example, for the home team, France in this case, if we inspect the element, you can see that this lives within a span element, and that span has a class of QA full team name. And you can see that this span has a parent element, that's also a span with a class of fixture team name home. So I'm going to reference that in our script again, and we're going to create a variable here called home. And to get that home team, we're going to use the result that we're iterating over, and BeautifulSoup has a select one method, and to that we can pass a CSS selector, and in this case we target that home team name and then find the child that has the QA full team name class, and we're using the dots in front of each of these to indicate that it's a class, and that's what happens with CSS selectors. The dot indicates a class name. So that gives us the home team, and it's very similar for the away team. So I'm going to copy what we have above here, and we can paste that below and change the -- home to away. And once we have that, let's print these out to make sure that we are actually getting some data here. But before we execute the script, remember this refers to an HTML element. What we need to do in order to get the team name or the text within it is use the .text attribute that's available on BeautifulSoup tag objects. So if we add that and execute the script, we should hopefully see these teams coming through. And we're not getting any results, and that's because I've used the wrong format here of the class. Instead of underscore class, we use class underscore here to indicate that we're looking for a div with a particular class name. And the reason we can't just use class is because obviously that's a reserved keyword in Python, so we need to pass a different keyword argument here, and it's class with an underscore at the end. So change that up and save the file, and we can re-execute this. And we are now getting the two sets of teams. So that's working fine. What we now need to do is get the number of goals each team has scored. So let's remove the print statement here. And we're now going to create a variable called home goals. And we're going to set that equal to another expression on the result. To find out what that is, let's go back to the DOM, and we're going to minimize this developer tools. And if we look at the France-Poland game and inspect the element with the number of goals for the home team, you can see that it has this class here, and I'm going to copy that to my clipboard and we're going to paste it into VS Code. And again, we're going to use the select one method because remember we're iterating over a fixture container here. So we only need one element for the home goals, and it's going to be that class here. And again, we chain .text to the end of that. And we can copy that line down to the line below, and we're going to define a variable called away goals. And all we need to do here is change the -- home at the end of the class to away. So now we have all the data that we need to actually create rows in our database. Now we imported at the top here the fixture model. What we're going to do is use that down here, and we're going to create these objects. So it's going to be fixture.objects.get or create. And to the get or create function, we're going to pass the data that we had here. So I'm going to paste that in below. So we're setting the team 1 field to the home, team 2 to away, and we're also setting the goals here. So that will create the object if it doesn't already exist in the database. That's the effect of using the get or create function. And that's actually all we need to do in this management command. But before we run it, make sure you fix this mistake if you've made this also. It should be fixture.objects.get or create, not object. Once we've done that, we can run the scrape results command, and that's going to gather this data from the BBC website and store it in our database. And then we're going to use that data to create a Plotly bar chart showing which team has scored the most goals at the World Cup. So the command's now finished, and I've opened the Django extension's shell plus. If we run the fixture.objects.count command, you now see we have 64 results, and that corresponds to 64 matches that were played in the World Cup. So we can exit the shell, we have the data in our database. The command has worked successfully. We can now go to our views.py file, and we have a very simple view here called scores. What we're going to do is we're going to import the fixture model at the top. So from core.models, import fixture. And within the view, I'm going to set a variable called fixtures here equal to all the fixtures that were in the database. Now what we're going to do is plot how many goals each team has scored. So we're going to need to fetch all the distinct teams in the World Cup. And we can do that using the fixtures that we have here on line 6. So let's copy the variable name and we're going to use the values list function. And what we're going to do is get the values for the team 1 and then we can call .distinct on that result. And that should give us back only the distinct teams in the World Cup. And to the values list function, we can also pass a keyword argument of flat equals true, and that will make that essentially a Python list, and it will return the distinct values within the list. So if we print out these teams to our terminal, we should have the unique teams. So what I'm going to do is start up Django's development server here with the run server command. And when we go to the browser, we see this page here. We're going to replace that with a plotly bar chart soon. For now, let's go back to the terminal and you can see a query set of unique teams has been printed out. So we now have all the teams in the World Cup. So we're going to now create a for loop. And we're going to say for each team within that list of teams. And what we want to do here is get all of the fixtures that team was involved in. So remember, there are 64 fixtures in the World Cup. Each team is going to be involved in at least 3 of those, or potentially more if they qualified. So what we're going to do here is we're going to filter down the fixtures, but we need to find teams that are in the fixture, so they could be team 1 or team 2. And to do an OR statement in Django's ORM, we're going to need to import a Q object at the top. So from django.db.models, we're going to import the Q object. And within the filter statement, we will create a Q object where team 1 is equal to the team that we're iterating over. So that's the first condition, which will match if team 1 is equal to, for example, Poland. But Poland might also be team 2, so we need to use the OR operator and create another Q object. So we'll say team 2 is equal to the team. So just to go over this statement one more time, we have a list of fixtures from line 7, that's all rows in the database. We then create a filter expression here, and the team that we're iterating over, for example Argentina or Poland, we check whether team 1 is equal to that team or whether team 2 is equal to that team. And the end result of that expression, it will give us back all fixtures for which that team was involved in at the World Cup. Now what we're going to do is create a plotly bar chart with the number of goals scored for each team in the World Cup. So what I'm going to do is create an empty dictionary, and we want a key for each team in the World Cup, and the value is going to be an integer with the number of goals that team scored. We're then going to create a variable here in the for loop called total goals. And this is going to be equal to the total number of goals that the team that we're iterating over has scored in these fixtures that we found on line 11. Now at the moment I'm going to make this equal to 0, but what we're going to do is we're going to add a method to our fixture model here, and this method is going to give us the number of goals that the team that's passed to the method has scored in the fixture. So let's create a function here, and we'll call this function getGoals, and that will take self, and it will also take a team name as an argument. And what we're going to do within the function is we're going to check if the team that's passed here is equal to self.team1, in which case we can return self.team1 goals. Otherwise, if team is equal to self.team2, we can then return self.team2 goals. And if the team that's passed as an argument is not one of team 1 or team 2, we're simply going to return none in that case. So hopefully you can see why this function here is necessary, or it's helpful. Let's say we have a team name of Argentina. That could either be team 1 or team 2. So we would then need to check that and then return the correct number of goals for that team. This function will help simplify some of the logic in our view here. So let's go back to that view. And what we're going to do is we're going to use the sum function in Python, and to that we're going to pass a list comprehension. And we want to iterate over each fixture in our team fixtures that we got on the line above there. And for each one of those fixtures, what we're going to do is we're going to call that getGoals function and pass the team that we're iterating over to that function. That will give us back the correct number of goals that team scored in this fixture. And we do that for all of the team fixtures that we found for this given team. And the final thing we're going to do is to the goals dictionary that we defined on line 9, we're going to set the key equal to the team name, and we're going to set the value equal to this total number of goals that they scored in the World Cup. So just to clarify what's happening in the for loop, we iterate over each team in the World Cup. We find all of the fixtures that team was involved in, and then for each one of those fixtures we get the number of goals back that the team scored, and we sum those up using Python's sum function, and add them to a dictionary. So we now have a data structure here containing each team's name and the number of goals they scored. What we're now going to do is plot that using Plotly as a bar chart. At the top here, I'm going to import plotly.express as px. And below the for loop, we're going to create a figure object, and we're going to use the plotlyExpress.bar function to do that. Now the bar function takes x data for what we want to show on the x-axis of the bar chart, and we want to set that equal to the team name. Now remember that the dictionary that we've produced here has a key for each team, so what we're going to do is we're going to use the dictionary.keys function. So the dictionary is called goals, and we can use the .keys function to get all the team names. So that's the x data. The y data is for the bars themselves, how tall will the bars be, and these should be equal to the number of goals that each team has scored. So that's going to be the values of the goals dictionary, so we can use the dictionary.values function here. And finally we'll give the plot a title, and that title will be the World Cup 2022 goals. So that's our figure containing the bar chart. What we can now do is add a key called chart to the context, and we're going to use the figures to HTML function to generate the HTML for that chart. And we can now reference this chart key within the template that's being returned from this view. So let's go to index.html and replace hello world with this statement here. We render the chart using the safe template filter. If we save that and go back to our page and refresh this page, hopefully we're now going to see a bar chart showing the number of goals each team has scored in the World Cup, and indeed that's what we get here. Now there's a few things I want to change here. I want to make this chart a little bit bigger for a start, so let's go back to the view here, and to the plotlyExpress.bar function we're going to pass a height equals 800 argument. So let's refresh this, and hopefully that will make the bar chart a little bit bigger. Now the second thing I want to do is let's order this data. We want the teams that scored the most goals first in the bar chart, and the teams that scored the least goals at the end of the bar chart. So let's go back to the view, and in order to do this we need to get this goals dictionary that contains each team and the number of goals they scored. We want to order that so that the team with the most goals appears first in the dictionary. Now these days in Python, dictionaries can be sorted data structures, and there's a function called sorted, and it's one of the built-ins in Python, and to that what we can use is the goals.items function. Goals.items will return a tuple for each value in the dictionary with the key and the value in that order. Now we want to sort by the value, so to the sorted function we can pass a key, and that's a lambda expression in this case, and we want to sort by the second element, the value. So we can index in at 1 here, and the reason that we do this is because goals.items returns the values as the second element in the tuple, and the first element is the key name. So if you don't understand that, try printing this out to the terminal. What that returns is a list of tuples, and that list is ordered as you can see below here. The teams that scored the least number of goals at the World Cup are first in the list, and the teams that scored the most are towards the end of the list. Now we can convert this list of tuples back to a dictionary using the dictionary function here, and what that's going to do is it will set the key to the first element in the tuple and the value to the second element. And we can reassign the result of that back to goals here. And let's now go back to our page and refresh this page. We now get the elements in order from the teams that scored the least goals to the teams that scored the most in the World Cup. And to get it from the most to the least goals, we can go back to our view, and the sorted function has another keyword argument, and that's the reverse equals true. If we add that and save this and go back to the page, when we refresh we get the teams that scored the most goals at the start of this list. So now with this bar chart we can very clearly see that France and Argentina are the two teams that scored the most goals at the World Cup, whereas Tunisia, Wales, Belgium and so on, they scored the least goals. So this is a pretty simple chart, but it demonstrates how we can take raw data and unstructured data from the web, and from HTML documents we can then process that data, store it in a format that we understand in a database, and then produce useful visualizations from that data in a Django application. So that's quite a lot of stuff packed into one video, but it shows how you can achieve some of these data processing and visualization tasks in a web application. So thank you for watching. I hope you've enjoyed this video. If you have, please like and subscribe to the channel, and we'll see you in the next video.